The wind carried a low whistle through the dry grasslands of the southwest, a lonely sound that seemed to echo the boy's heart. The sun was beginning to drop behind the red hills, turning the world to copper and gold. He stood barefoot on the cracked earth, a small figure in tattered clothes. Clutching a feather he had found near a dead hawk days ago. His name was not written anywhere, not spoken by anyone anymore. He had been cast out from his people, called cursed, different, unworthy of their fire. So he walked alone until his feet bled and his shadow stretched longer than his hope. By the time he found the old cabin, he had nothing left but the small bundle tied with rope and a heart that refused to stop beating. The place stood crooked at the edge of a forgotten trail, its roof half caved in, its windows staring out like hollow eyes. The boards were gray with age, and the door hung loose from one hinge. It was not a home, not yet. But when the boy looked at it, something deep inside him stirred. Maybe it was because the cabin, like him, had been abandoned. Maybe because both still stood despite the storms that had broken everything else. He sat down beside the doorway, rested his head against the wood, and whispered softly that he would not leave. Not again. The first night was cold. Coyotes howled somewhere across the ridge, and the boy could hear the wind dragging dust against the walls. He curled inside an old corner, using his small coat as a blanket. When he awoke, the morning light poured through the gaps in the roof, painting golden stripes across the dirt floor. He could smell wild sage and the faint sweetness of dry grass. For the first time in many nights, he smiled. The land was harsh, yes, but it was alive, and it did not reject him. That morning he began to work. His small hands were quick, rough, and determined. He pulled weeds from the ground around the cabin, dragged fallen branches from the nearby creek bed, and patched holes with whatever he could find. Each task made him feel stronger, like he was sewing together the pieces of himself that others had torn apart. There were moments when his stomach growled so loud that it echoed, but he would keep going. Hunger had been his only companion for so long that he treated it like an old friend. He learned to listen to the land, to notice where the rabbits hid, where the roots ran deep under the soil, and where water collected after the rare rains. Days turned into weeks. The boy used the feathers he found to decorate the cabin's walls, tied with bits of vine and string. He built a small garden near the doorway where wild beans began to grow. At night, the stars looked closer here, as if they wanted to keep him company. He would sit by a small fire, whispering to the flames, like they were spirits that could understand him. In the silence, he would sometimes remember the faces of those who turned away from him. But instead of anger, he began to feel something else, something like peace. The past was gone, but this land, this cabin, was his now one morning. As he was gathering stones to build a small fence, he found an injured bird caught in a thorn bush. Its wing was torn, its tiny body trembling. The boy moved slowly, whispering the way his mother once did when calming frightened horses. He freed the bird and took it back to the cabin, wrapping it in soft grass and bits of cloth. Each day, he fed it crumbs and kept it warm by the fire. He watched it heal, watched its wings tremble stronger, until one day it flew again, circling above the roof before disappearing into the sky. That night, he looked up and whispered, "You came back to the world. Maybe I can too." The seasons began to change. Rain returned to the valley, filling the air with the smell of life. Tiny green shoots pushed through the dirt, and the garden began to bloom. Wildflowers spread across the hill like spilled paint. The boy's skin grew darker from the sun, his body stronger from the work. The cabin, once a ruin, now looked alive again. Smoke rose from the chimney. The walls were lined with smooth stones, and the doorway had a small sign he carved with a stick that simply said, "Home." Sometimes, travelers passed by the trail. They would see the smoke or the sound of laughter carried by the wind and stop to look. Some thought it strange that a boy lived alone in such a place. Others thought it a miracle. A few left bits of bread or fruit by the gate, never speaking to him directly, but nodding in respect. Slowly, the stories began to spread through nearby settlements about the Apache boy who had built his own paradise out of nothing but dust and dreams. But not everyone liked those stories. Beyond the valley, in the town near the railroad tracks, There were men who looked upon the land as theirs. They claimed the soil for cattle and the hills for gold. To them, the boy's little home was not a miracle, it was a trespass. They said the land belonged to the company, not to some wild child. And so as the whispers grew, so did their anger. They sent riders to see what was true. The boy saw them one evening from the ridge, 4 men on horses, their hats low, their eyes cold. He stood silently beside the cabin, his heart pounding, his hand tightening around the small stick knife he had carved himself. The riders stopped by the fence. They looked at the garden, the smoke, the rebuilt roof. One of them laughed, another spat into the dirt. "You're living on company land, boy," one of them said. "You best be gone before we come back." The boy didn't answer. He just looked at them, his jaw set. When they rode away, the wind picked up dust behind them, but the cabin stood still. That night, he did not sleep. He sat by the fire, staring at the orange glow as if trying to find answers in it. The days that followed were heavy with silence. Even the birds seemed to sense something was coming. The boy began to hide supplies in the ground behind the cabin water, dried beans, small tools. He did not know what he would do if they came back, only that he would not run again. This land had given him life. He would protect it. Then one night a storm broke across the valley. Thunder rolled like drums from the sky, and lightning flashed over the hills. The cabin shook as the wind roared, ripping at the roof. The boy ran outside to tie down the door, rain stinging his face. Through the storm, he thought he saw shapes moving in the distant shadows on horseback. For a moment, his breath caught in his throat. Were they men or ghosts? He couldn't tell, but he knew, deep down, that something was about to change. By morning, the storm was gone. The ground was soaked, the creek running wild again. The boy walked outside, his bare feet sinking into the wet earth. The air smelled new, clean, alive. But on the far side of the field, near the fence, he saw something half buried in the mud, a boot print. It was fresh, deep, and not his. He crouched, his fingers tracing the edge of it, and his heart began to pound again. He turned toward the cabin. Smoke no longer rose from the chimney. The wind was still. The paradise he had built stood quiet, but not safe anymore. Something, or someone, was coming. And this time, he wouldn't face it as a rejected boy. He would face it as the keeper of this land, the boy who made a home out of ruins, and who would fight to keep it standing. The morning after the storm was heavy with silence. The air was thick with the smell of wet soil and smoke from distant fires. The boy stood by the fence, staring at the boot print again, trying to understand what it meant. He looked around, half expecting someone to appear from behind the trees, but there was no one. Only the wind brushing against the grass and the faint rustle of the cabin's wooden boards settling after the rain. Still, the mark in the mud told him he was no longer alone. Someone had come close during the night. Someone who knew where he lived now. He carried water from the creek and washed the mud off his hands. Each movement felt slower than usual, his mind busy with questions. The riders had warned him before, and now one of them had returned. Maybe more would follow. He looked at the cabin, at the garden he had built with his own hands, at the small birdhouse by the window, and he felt something fierce rise inside him. He wasn't just a boy anymore. This was his home. It was all he had, and he would not give it up easily. Later that day, he walked beyond the ridge for the first time in weeks. The ground was soft and damp, the air cool against his skin. He followed a deer trail through the trees, careful not to leave tracks too close to his land. He wanted to see if anyone was camping nearby. The world beyond his valley always felt different, louder, less forgiving. He reached a hill that overlooked the distant road, and in the fading light, saw it. Smoke curling from a small fire near the trail, and beside it, 3 horses tied to a tree. He crouched low, his heart beat loud in his ears. The men were back, and they hadn't forgotten. He stayed hidden, watching. The men were talking, their laughter rough and sharp. He couldn't hear every word, but he caught enough to understand. They spoke about the Indian kid in the cabin by the creek, talked about claiming the land and tearing the place down before someone else took it. He He gripped the branch beside him until the bark broke under his fingers. The world had taken everything from him once before. He would not let it happen again. When night came, he returned quietly to the cabin. The moon hung low, silver against the dark sky. He gathered what food he had and moved some of it into a hidden pit behind the garden. He sharpened his wooden knife and fixed the door's latch with rope. It wasn't much, but it was enough to feel a little safer. Then he sat by the fire, thinking of the men, the smoke, and the words he had heard. His heart felt heavy, but his spirit was steady. He had faced hunger, loneliness, and fear before. He could face this too. In the following days, he worked harder than ever. The garden grew thicker, and he built small traps near the edges of the clearing to warn him if anyone came close. He began collecting stones, stacking them around the cabin's base to make the walls stronger. He even carved small marks into the wood symbols he remembered from his people, the kind meant to protect and bring courage. He didn't know if they still held any power, but he needed to believe they did. Belief was sometimes all a person had in a land like this. One afternoon, as he was cutting wood by the creek, he heard a faint sound behind him. He froze, the axe still in his hands. It wasn't an animal. It was the soft shuffle of footsteps. When he turned, a young woman stood there, her clothes dusty, her eyes wide with surprise. She looked tired, her hands trembling as she held a small sack against her chest. For a moment, they both just stared. Then she spoke in a low, careful voice. She said she meant no harm, that she had been walking for days after her wagon broke near the hills. She asked if she could rest by the creek. The boy didn't know what to say. He hadn't spoken to anyone in so long that words felt strange on his tongue. But something about her voice reminded him of the quiet tone his mother once used when she told him stories under the stars. So he nodded. She knelt by the water and drank slowly, her reflection trembling with the ripples. When she looked back at him, she noticed the small feather in his hair and asked if he lived here alone. He said yes. Her eyes softened with pity, but she didn't ask why. Instead, she thanked him, then took a small piece of dried bread from her sack and offered it to him. He refused at first, but she insisted. It was the first time someone had shared anything with him since he had been cast out. As the day faded, she stayed near the creek, humming softly while washing her hands. She told him she was heading toward the next town, where her uncle worked near the railway. Her family had been traveling west when sickness struck their camp. She was the only one left. The boy listened quietly, understanding the weight of loss without needing to say it. Before she left, she looked toward the cabin and said it was a good place, peaceful, and that he was lucky to have it. He watched her disappear down the trail until the trees swallowed her up. For the first time in a long while, felt something warm inside him that wasn't fire, something like hope. But the next morning, found fresh tracks again near the fence. They weren't hers. They were deeper, heavier. He followed them carefully, his breath tight, until they led him to the edge of the ridge. There he saw the same men from before, closer now. They had tents this time, and one of them had a rifle slung over his shoulder. He turned back quietly, every step feeling heavier than the last. He knew they would come soon. Maybe not today, but soon. That evening, as he patched a leak in the roof, he thought about what the woman had said, about luck, peace, and the idea of home. He had built all of this because he had nowhere else to go, because the world had left him behind. But maybe this was bigger than him now. Maybe this place meant something more, something worth fighting for. He looked out across the valley, the sky glowing orange as the sun set behind the hills. It was beautiful and still, like the world was holding its breath. He wondered how long he could keep it that way. As the days passed, strange things began to happen around the cabin. One morning, the boy found one of his traps triggered, but nothing inside. Another time, he heard voices at night, faint and far, carried by the wind. Once, he woke to the sound of hoofbeats, but when he ran outside, there was nothing but the open land under the moon. He started sleeping lighter, always listening. The fear of being alone had turned into the fear of being found. One night, he climbed the hill behind the cabin to look over the valley. The stars were bright, the air sharp and still. From there he could see faint lights flickering near the creek campfires, maybe 2 or 3. His chest tightened. The men had moved closer. He knew what that meant. They were waiting for something, maybe daylight, maybe the right time to drive him out. He sat there for hours watching the lights until the cold began to bite through his skin. Then he went back down, his mind racing. When dawn came, he packed a small bag. Inside, he placed a few pieces of dried food, a carved feather, and a stone from the creek. He didn't plan to leave for good, but he knew he might need to hide for a while. Before stepping out, he looked around the cabin one more time. The patched roof, the small fire pit, the flowers by the doorway. Everything here was a piece of him. He whispered that he would come back, no matter what happened. Then he set out through the woods, keeping low, following the trail toward the far ridge. From there, he could see smoke rising again, but now it was thicker, darker. His heart pounded as he realized what it meant. The men were burning something. Maybe brush, maybe more. He started to run, the ground rough under his feet. The closer he got, the stronger the smell of smoke became. When he reached the ridge, he stopped, breathless. Down below, near the creek, one of the men stood by a smoldering fire. And just beyond him, he saw the faint outline of something he feared more than anything, the path of fresh boot prints. Leading straight back toward his cabin, the wind picked up again, sweeping across the valley, carrying with it the sharp scent of burning wood and danger. The boy's hands shook, but his eyes stayed fixed on the horizon. He knew there was no more time to wait. The home he built from nothing, the place that had given him life, was now in the path of men who saw only land to take. As the sun fell behind the ridge, the light touched his face, turning his tears to gold. He took one deep breath and began to walk back toward the cabin, toward whatever waited for him there. By the time the boy reached the edge of the clearing, the sun was low and the smoke was rising higher, twisting into the pale sky. His heart beat hard in his chest as he crouched behind a cluster of bushes. The smell of burning wood was stronger now. He could see the cabin in the distance, still standing, but surrounded by trampled grass. His small garden was crushed, the fence broken. One of the men was there, kicking at the door with his boot, while another tied their horses nearby. The boy's throat tightened. Everything he had built, every piece of peace he had found, was in their hands. He stayed hidden, watching. The men were arguing. He couldn't make out every word, but their tone was rough and impatient. One of them said something about company orders and clearing this land. Another said there wasn't much to clear, that it was just a kid's shack. Then the man at the door raised a match and laughed, saying a few flames would solve everything. The boy gripped the branch beside him until his fingers ached. He couldn't move. He couldn't shout. Fear held him like a chain, but so did anger. Suddenly, a horse neighed loud enough to make the men turn. The boy took the chance to slip around the side, moving through the tall grass until he was closer to the creek. The water glimmered faintly in the light, calm and silent, as if it didn't care what was happening above it. He dipped his hand in, letting the cold water steady him. Then he picked up a stone, smooth and heavy, and looked back toward the men. He couldn't fight them, not yet. But he needed to protect what he could. That night, after they left, he crept back to the cabin. The door was cracked, but still standing. The fire hadn't spread far. Only part of the fence had burned. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air smelled of smoke and wet ash. His feather decorations were blackened at the edges, his bed of straw scattered. He sank to his knees, tears welling in his eyes, not from pain, but from something deeper. They hadn't taken everything. Not yet. He still had his land, and as long as the ground beneath him was his, he would rebuild again. Over the next few days, the boy worked quietly. He repaired what he could, though his mind stayed heavy with worry. He knew they would come back. The men didn't give up easily, so he started to prepare. He gathered food and tools, hid them in secret spots around the valley, and began to carve signs into nearby tree marks that only he could read. Each one was a reminder of where to go if he had to run, a plan if things turned worse. But the boy wasn't the only one watching the land. One afternoon, while fetching water from the creek, he saw a figure standing near the ridge. It was the same young woman who had stopped by before. She was holding a bundle wrapped in cloth and looking down at the cabin. When she noticed him, she lifted her hand slightly, but didn't come closer. Her face was pale, worried. She called out that she had heard men talking in town, saying they would return soon to clear the land for mining. She said they believed gold was buried beneath the valley. The boy frowned. He had never seen any gold, only stones and roots. But he understood what greed could do. The woman told him she couldn't stay, that it wasn't safe for her either. But before leaving, she handed him the bundle. Inside were a few dried fruits, some matches, and a small knife. She said he might need them soon. He thanked her quietly, unable to find the right words. Before walking away, she looked at him with a kind of sadness that made the air feel heavier. "Don't let them take your home," she said. "It's the only place left that feels alive." After she left, the boy sat by the creek, staring at the reflection of the cabin in the water. He thought about the people in the town, about the men who wanted his land, and about the woman who had risked coming back just to warn him. The world outside his valley was restless, filled with voices that wanted more than they needed. But here, every tree, every blade of grass had meaning. He couldn't understand why others couldn't see it. As the days passed, the tension grew. The boy could feel it in the air, thick and strange, like the calm before a storm. Birds stopped singing near the cabin. The sky turned gray more often. The wind carried the sound of distant hammering from the west, where the men were building something. He climbed the hill one evening and saw new tents by the trail, more horses, more smoke. It wasn't just a few men anymore. It looked like a small camp. That night, sleep wouldn't come. He sat by the fire inside the cabin, listening to the crackle of wood. His thoughts wandered to his childhood, to the faces he barely remembered. He thought about how his people once lived freely across this land, before fences and roads divided it. Now, even this small valley was under threat. He felt like he was standing at the edge of a story much older than himself, a story of land and loss. Of those who were always told to move on. The next morning, he woke to find smoke again, but this time it wasn't from the cabin. It was from the ridge. He climbed up and saw men digging, their shovels glinting in the light. They were setting up wooden frames and driving stakes into the ground. It wasn't mining yet, but it was close. He could hear one of them shouting orders, his voice cutting through the wind. The boy crouched behind a rock, his heart pounding. He knew that once they began digging, the valley would never be the same. He ran back to the cabin and gathered his things. He didn't know what he would do, only that he had to do something. He built a small signal fire near the edge of the creek, just enough to make smoke without catching attention too soon. Then he took the knife the woman had given him and carved a new symbol into the cabin door, a mark of protection. The kind his people once used to call upon strength from the earth. He whispered to the land, asking it to stand with him, even if no one else would. Later that evening, as the sky turned deep red, he heard footsteps again. This time, they weren't heavy boots, but something softer. When he turned, he saw a man standing by the fence, older, wearing worn clothes and a wide hat. He looked tired, his beard gray, his eyes steady. The boy took a cautious step back, but the man raised his hands peacefully. He said he wasn't with the company, that he had worked for them once, but left when he saw what they did to people. He said he had come to warn the boy those men would not stop. The man told him the company had found a map from old records, one that showed gold veins running near the valley. He said they planned to claim the whole stretch by force within days. The boy asked why he was telling him this. The man looked at the cabin, at the garden that was still trying to grow, and said quietly that some places deserve to be protected. Then he reached into his coat and handed the boy a small pouch. Inside were a few bullets and an old compass. He said he couldn't fight anymore, but maybe the boy still could. In his own way, before leaving, the man looked at the cabin one last time and said, "The land remembers those who stand for it. Don't let them forget you." Then he disappeared into the trees. That night, the boy couldn't stop thinking about his words. The fire flickered against the walls, lighting the carvings he had made, the marks of his story. He walked outside and looked at the valley, the same valley that had given him shelter, that had listened when no one else did. The moonlight made everything glow, pale silver, quiet and endless. Somewhere beyond the ridge, the men were still working, their firelight faint and distant. He knew what was coming. Soon there would be more noise, more men, and more destruction. But something inside him had changed. The fear that once made him hide now burned like a promise. He was small, but the land around him was not. It had raised him, fed him, and given him purpose. And now it needed him in return. He walked back into the cabin, closed the door, and sat by the window, staring out at the horizon. The night was still, but the air carried a strange energy, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The boy whispered to the dark, not a prayer but a vow that when the men came again, they would not find the same frightened child. They would find someone who belonged to this land more deeply than any of them ever could. Outside, the wind rose, sweeping through the grass like a voice from the hills. The cabin creaked, the fire hissed, and the boy's eyes stayed open. Watching the night stretch over the valley, he called home, waiting for the dawn that would bring whatever came next. The morning came cold and gray. A thin layer of mist clung to the valley, softening the edges of the world. The boy stood by the doorway of the cabin, staring at the horizon, where the company's campfires still burned like distant eyes. He hadn't slept at all. Every sound in the night had stirred him: the cry of an owl, the crack of a branch, the whisper of wind through the grass. Now, with dawn rising, he knew that whatever was coming would arrive soon. The land was too quiet. It's the kind of silence that always comes before something breaks. He went about his morning in silence, though his hands trembled. He filled his water jug at the creek, gathered dry wood, and checked the traps he had set along the trail. The traps weren't much, just warnings, but they gave him some comfort. He could see where deer had passed during the night, where the earth was freshly disturbed. Life still moved here, even when men wanted to take it. That thought gave him strength. As he walked back toward the cabin, a soft sound made him stop. It came from the trees, low and steady, like metal striking metal. He crept closer and saw 3 men on the ridge, hammering stakes into the ground. They were marking the land. His land. He crouched behind a fallen log, his heart pounding. The men were laughing, talking about how they'd soon bring in wagons and machines. He heard one of them mention the boy, the little Apache squatter, who thought he could keep company land. The words burned like fire inside him. He wanted to shout, to throw something to make them stop, but he stayed silent. He needed to think. When they finally left, he ran back to the cabin. He grabbed the old compass the stranger had given him, holding it in his palm like a piece of the earth itself. The needle quivered, steadying toward north, toward the town. He knew that if he wanted to save his valley, he couldn't do it alone. Someone out there must still remember what was right. Someone must care about the land the way he did. He packed a small bag, took some dried fruit, and a piece of smoked rabbit, then set off toward the trail that led west. The wind was against him, sharp and cold, but he walked fast, his bare feet light on the dirt. The land rolled on for miles, and by midday he could see the faint outline of the town's rooftops shimmering in the distance. Smoke rose from chimneys, and the smell of iron and oil hung in the air. It felt strange, almost foreign after so long in the quiet valley. When he reached the town, people stopped to stare. A small boy with long hair, carrying nothing but a bundle and a worn knife, didn't belong here. He ignored their whispers and went straight to the general store. The old man behind the counter looked up from his ledger, startled. The boy asked if he knew about the company that was building near the creek. The man sighed, said everyone knew, and that nothing could be done. The land was already claimed, papers signed, money exchanged. Once they get gold in their eyes, the man said, no one listens to reason. The boy asked about the sheriff, hoping someone could help. The old man hesitated, then pointed toward the office near the end of the street. But his voice was low when he added, don't expect much. They all work for the same pocket. The boy thanked him and went. The sheriff's office was quiet, a single man sitting behind a desk reading a newspaper. The boy told him about the men, the cabin, the land, everything. The sheriff didn't even look up. He said the company had legal rights, that a squatter couldn't claim property. "You best find another place," he muttered. "That land's not yours." The words hit like stones. The boy stood there for a moment, fists clenched, then turned and walked out without another word. He wandered through the town, the noise and chatter around him sounding distant. He thought about his cabin, his garden, the bird he once saved. Everything he had built was about to be taken away because no one saw its worth. As he passed the small church near the edge of town, he noticed the same young woman he had met before. She was carrying a basket of bread, her clothes cleaner, but her eyes the same kind and tired. She saw him and hurried over. When he told her what was happening, she looked troubled. She said she had heard the men in the saloon bragging about clearing the valley that very night. They planned to burn whatever was left to make way for machinery. Her voice shook as she spoke, and the boy could see she was afraid to. Still, she handed him a small bag of food and told him not to give up. "There's more strength in your heart than in their hands," she said softly. He left town as the sky began to darken, clouds rolling over the hills. The wind carried the smell of rain again, but he didn't stop. His feet moved fast over the dirt trail, his chest aching from the run. By the time he reached the ridge, the valley below was already filled with motion lantern lights flickering near his cabin, shadows of men moving around it. The storm clouds gathered above, dark and heavy, and thunder began to rumble in the distance. He crouched low, watching. The men were carrying oil barrels, setting them near the walls. His stomach twisted. They were going to burn it, just like they said. His small home, the place that had kept him alive through loneliness and hunger, was about to be turned to ash. The boy's breath came hard, every muscle in his body trembling. He thought of running down there, shouting, doing something to stop them. But he knew what they'd do if they caught him. Then he remembered the old man's words, the pouch of bullets, the compass. Maybe he didn't have a gun, but he had the land. He knew every stone, every hollow, every path through the brush. They didn't. He slipped through the grass to the creek, moving silently. The water was high from the earlier rains, rushing hard against the banks. He took the rope he used for hauling wood and stretched it across the shallow bend of the creek, tying it tight between two trees. Then he moved back toward the cabin, his eyes fixed on the glow of lanterns. The men had started to argue again. One wanted to wait until morning. Another said to do it now, before the weather turned worse. Lightning flashed across the sky, lighting up their faces. The boy could see their shapes clearly for men, one holding a rifle, another with a torch. His heart hammered so loud he was afraid they would hear it. The torch flared, sparks rising in the wind. He watched in horror as the man stepped closer to the cabin door. Just then, the first drops of rain began to fall. They hissed as they hit the flames, small but sharp. The wind picked up, whipping through the valley with sudden force. One of the men cursed, trying to shield the torch. Another yelled that they should hurry before the rain ruined everything. The boy clenched his fists, his nails cutting into his palms. He had to act. If he waited any longer, it would be too late. He picked up a handful of stones from the creek and threw one toward the ridge. It hit a tree, snapping a branch. The men turned sharply, shouting. Another stone followed, this one landing closer. They thought someone was coming from the woods. The boy could see their lanterns swinging wildly as they spread out, trying to see who was there. He moved through the shadows, heart racing. Grabbing what he could from near the cabin, his bundle, the small feather, and the carved symbol from the doorway, the thunder roared louder, lightning tearing through the clouds. The men shouted again, their voices breaking through the wind. One fired his rifle into the darkness, the shot echoing across the valley. The boy ducked low, mud splashing around him. The rain came harder now, pouring down in sheets, soaking everything. The torch went out in the storm. The boy crawled behind the rocks near the creek, gripping the compass in one hand. The men were still searching, but their anger was turning to confusion. They couldn't see through the rain. One of them slipped in the mud, cursing. Another yelled to pack up before the storm trapped them. The boy held his breath as they stumbled past, their lanterns dimming one by one, when they finally retreated toward the ridge. The boy stayed still for a long time, the rain pounding on his back. He looked up at the cabin, its roof dripping, its walls scarred but still standing. The land had fought for him tonight, just as he had for it. But he knew this wasn't over. The men would come back, and next time, they would bring more than torches. He stood slowly, every muscle aching. The thunder rolled again, deep and heavy, shaking the ground beneath him. He could feel it in his chest, the promise of what was coming. The land was awake now, the sky full of storm and fire. He turned toward the cabin, water running down his face. He whispered to himself that he would be ready. The wind howled across the valley, bending the tall grass flat. The boy's small figure stood alone in the rain, between the ruined garden and the wild creek, watching the dark ridge where the men had vanished. Lightning flashed again, for an instant, lighting up his face, young, fierce, and unbroken. The battle for his home had only begun. The storm rolled on through the night, and the valley trembled under the weight of thunder. The boy stayed awake, watching from the cabin's window as flashes of lightning lit the world outside in brief, sharp moments. Each strike revealed the land he loved, the soaked garden, the broken fence, the trees swaying hard in the wind, but it was all still there. The men were gone. For now, that was enough. He sat by the small fire until the flames turned to soft orange embers, and when the rain finally quieted, his eyes grew heavy. Exhaustion pulled him down, and he slept for the first time in days, his hand resting over the small compass the old man had given him. When morning came, the valley smelled of wet grass and fresh soil. The storm had washed away the footprints, the ashes, even the signs of fire the men had left behind. Everything looked clean again, almost peaceful. The boy stepped outside, the earth soft beneath his bare feet. The air was cool, and thin mist floated above the creek. He looked at his cabin, still standing, the smoke from last night's fire curling gently from the chimney. It wasn't perfect, but it was home. He spent the morning walking the land, checking the traps, the garden, the small trail that led to the ridge. He wanted to be sure no one had returned during the night. Everything was still. Even the birds had come back, their songs soft but sure. The boy knelt by the edge of his garden and brushed his fingers over the leaves that had survived the storm. The beans and wildflowers were bent, but they were alive, reaching again toward the light. He smiled faintly, feeling the same way inside, bent, but still standing. Later that day, he saw movement near the ridge. His heart tensed until he recognized the familiar shape of the woman walking toward him. She was carrying another bundle, her clothes damp from the wet path. When she reached the cabin, she looked around at the damage and shook her head. "They tried, didn't they?" she said softly. The boy nodded. She placed the bundle on the ground, revealing bread, dried meat, and a wool blanket. "I heard what happened," she said. "The town's talking about it. Some of the men didn't come back last night. The company's pulling out for now. The storm did what no one else could." The boy listened quietly, feeling a strange mix of relief and disbelief. He had fought to protect this place, but it was the storm that had driven the men away. The woman told him the company had lost equipment in the flood, and that their bosses decided the valley wasn't worth the trouble anymore. The land would be left alone, at least for a while. She said she was leaving town too, heading farther west, where her uncle had found work on the railway. "I just wanted to see you before I go," she added. "You did something brave here." He didn't answer, just looked around at the valley that now felt calm and safe again. Before she left, she placed her hand on his shoulder and said, "Don't stop building. This place will remember you." Then she turned and walked down the trail, her figure fading into the distance. The boy watched until she was gone. Days passed, and life returned to its slow rhythm. The sun warmed the valley again, drying the earth and filling the air with the smell of sage. The boy repaired what was broken, planted new seeds, and patched the roof where the storm had torn it. He even carved new designs into the doorway, symbols of strength, of hope, and of belonging. When he finished, he stood back and looked at his work. The cabin no longer looked like a place someone had abandoned. It looked alive, full of story and meaning. One morning, as he walked by the creek, he found something half buried in the mud, a piece of iron, part of a man's tool. He picked it up and turned it over in his hand. It was rusted and heavy, But in it, he saw a reminder of everything that had happened. The land had taken back what men tried to steal, and in doing so, it had spared him. He set the iron piece on a rock near the garden as a sign, not of fear, but of memory. The weeks turned into months. The boy grew taller, his face stronger. The loneliness that had once followed him now felt softer, almost like an old friend who had taught him what strength meant. He began to see the valley differently, not just as a place to survive, but as a part of himself. Every tree, every stream, every patch of earth carried his story now. Sometimes he spoke to the land out loud, thanking it for standing with him when no one else did. And when the wind answered through the leaves, he liked to think it was the land speaking back. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, he saw a shadow at the edge of the trail. It was the old man who had given him the compass. The boy hadn't seen him since that night before the storm. The man looked older, his beard longer, his steps slower. He smiled when he saw the cabin standing proud again. "I heard you kept your promise," he said. "The land's still yours?" The boy nodded, holding up the compass. "It kept me strong," he said. The man laughed softly. "No," he replied. "You did that yourself." They sat by the fire that night, sharing food in silence. The old man told stories about when the valley had been full of people, when the rivers were wide and the earth untouched by greed. He spoke of how the land always finds a way to protect itself, and how those who love it are never truly alone. Before dawn, the old man stood and said he had to keep moving. He left the boy with a final piece of advice. "Remember this place, but don't stay afraid. The world is wide, and it still needs hearts like yours." After he left, the boy walked to the top of the hill. The valley stretched below him, golden in the morning light. He could see the cabin, the garden, the creek, and beyond it all, the endless plains that faded into the horizon. The air was still and warm. He took a deep breath, feeling the life around him, the buzz of insects, the rustle of grass, the steady pulse of the land itself. Everything that had happened, the pain, the fear, the fire, had led him here. That evening he built a small monument near the cabin, using stones from the creek. In the center he placed the compass and the piece of rusted iron. It was a reminder of what had been lost and what had been saved. He carved a single word into the largest stone: home. It wasn't just a word anymore. It was a promise. As the years went on, the valley changed slowly but beautifully. Wildflowers grew where the fence had once stood, and trees began to rise again near the creek. The boy became a young man known by travelers who passed through as the one who lived in the valley and cared for the land. Some came to trade food or share stories. Others came simply to sit in the quiet, to feel the peace that hung in the air there. The company never returned. The gold they had hoped for was never found, and the world moved on to other places, chasing other dreams. But the small cabin remained, weathered yet strong. Its smoke rising each morning as a sign that someone still kept the valley alive in time. The man who had once been a lonely, rejected boy came to understand that what he had built wasn't just for himself. It was for the land that raised him, for the memory of his people, for anyone who needed to know that even the smallest soul could stand against the storm and still find peace. Years later, travelers passing through would often tell stories about the hidden Valia place where the air was sweet, where the water ran clear, and where a single cabin stood surrounded by endless wildflowers. They said that if you listened closely, you could hear the sound of a young voice carried on the wind, whispering words of gratitude to the earth. And sometimes, in the quiet after rain, when the sky turned gold and the creek shone like glass, it felt as if the valley itself breathed again, alive and free, remembering the boy who had once turned its ruins into paradise. The sun sank low that final night, casting long shadows across the hills. Inside the cabin, the fire flickered softly, warming the wooden walls that had seen storms and silence and survival. Outside, the wind carried the scent of grass and wild herbs through the open window. The man sat by the doorway, watching the horizon fade into the soft light of evening. He smiled quietly, his heart full, knowing that everything he had fought for had finally come to rest. The land was safe. The cabin was strong. And somewhere deep in that valley, where every stone and leaf held his story, the boy who had once been rejected by everyone had found his forever home.